Emma Merlotin was a 35-year-old French courtesan, basically a prostitute for wealthy and prominent customers. On the rainy night of December 22nd, 1885, a police officer, alerted to screams coming from her cottage, entered to find her dead, partially under the bed, brutally hacked to death with an axe. Later on, her close friend Amelia would tell investigators how just before 11 p.m. that night, she had heard Emma greet a male individual, heard them laugh briefly, and then shortly after that, heard Emma scream. Initially, investigators thought the motive was robbery. However, a gold ring with a signet setting had fallen off her finger and had a small chip in it as if hit with an axe. She was wearing gold earrings, and there was about $16 in cash in the cottage, which is about $480 today.
Well, they did arrest a suspect that night.
Yeah, they did. It was a guy named William Sundstrom, and there's an interesting account in the Oregonian from December 27th, 1885 about it. It says, Friday night, about 11:30, Wood and Dougherty, who were the jailer and bailiff, while nosing around in the vicinity where the murder was committed, observed 3 men prowling around. One of them had his face quite badly scratched, and this fact excited the officers' attention. It was not long until they saw the man with the scratched face trying to get into the back way to the cottage of the murdered woman. And Dougherty and Wood, without waiting for anything further, placed the man under arrest. He gave his name as William Sundstrom and said he worked for Captain Burnett, Paymaster USA, at his place on Klug Street. He denied all knowledge of the murder and said he received the scratches that were on his face by falling against a trunk, which I assume is a tree. And they went to his house, or they brought him there, I guess his room in or whatever place he lived in on this property, and they said they found a pair of blood-stained pantaloons, which he said it was paint. And then they also found a hatchet that happened to have what he said was paint on it, and then it was examined under a microscope and found to be some kind of blood. But it's interesting because he wasn't actually kept very long. He was released after a fairly short time in this case. I guess they didn't have enough to really connect him to anything besides potentially having bloody-looking objects in his place. But in an effort to determine suspects, investigators took some extraordinary measures. In the vain hope that examination under the photographer's lens of the retina of the murdered woman's eye would reveal a likeness of her slayer, one of the eyes was cut out yesterday and placed in the hands of a well-known photographer.
She was born 8 November 1850, died 22 December 1885. Anne Jeanne Tingray-Lacaze. And I just wonder why she's Tingray-Lacaze.
Yeah.
Maybe because she doesn't seem to have been married to him. She was married to a guy named Merlotin who left her, abandoned her in New York, and that's when she became a prostitute, I think.
And she was born in France, right?
I believe so.
I think Brest, France, and I think it said that she'd come here about 5 or 8 years.
I think that's right.
Before she died from New York.
And that was typical in those days. People think of this as the first unsolved murder in Portland, but that's not true. Possibly the first is Mary Sullivan at the Beehive Saloon.
4 or 5 years earlier. So why do you think this became kind of legendarily associated as the first?
Well, because first of all, Mary Sullivan was really swept under the rug. I personally think that Police Chief James LePass is the one who killed her. So this one, everybody knew. She was a very popular person in the downtown area. She lived in the Tenderloin district, and it was a really brutal murder. I think the brutality is what made it legendary.
First descriptions in the story were really graphic too. I mean, they described much more so than people today would expect. You know, you'd think that in the old days be very modest about those kinds of things. It mentions 12 axe or hatchet wounds all over her and all kinds of terrible, brutal descriptions.
The newspapers really played it up. But the first actual murder victim, who was a woman, is Mrs. W.T. Franklin, killed by her husband in a murder-suicide in 1875. After 1875, about one woman murder victim a year. So it was unusual for a woman to be murdered, unusual for a prostitute to be murdered. So I think that it was a famous murder because it was an odd thing, and it was something that was really shocking.
Which is interesting too, because in 2018 it's easy to think, well, a prostitute being murdered, that seems sort of almost like a commonplace, but it wasn't at that time.
It wasn't at that time. It's not until the 1890s that we start seeing women regularly victims of murder. This was the Tenderloin. It's the block here between 3rd and 4th, between Yamhill and Taylor. And there were 2 large buildings on the block. There were boarding houses, or what they called bagnios. The rest of the block was in these small buildings called cribs, and French courtesans lived in them. And I understand that some of them were pretty nice. They would fix them up with little gardens and try to make it homey. It was a pretty upscale venue for prostitution. This neighborhood at that time was mostly hotels and saloons. So this was a very busy spot at night. Carrie Bradley's bagno was on, I think it was on 3rd Avenue here. Didn't they say that Emma Merlotin was at 3rd and Yamhill?
3rd and Yamhill, but on the southwest corner, so that would be about just down here. Let's go that way.
Right at the end of this block. And so, as we walked down here, we would have been walking right past Carrie Bradley's bagno. And Carrie Bradley's case was a big political case that involved Police Chief LePaez, who supposedly took bribes from Carrie and the other murderers to let them get out of town. But right at the end of this block is where Emma Merlotin's crib would have been. And it would have been just a very small house. It probably had a garden. And she might have fixed it up so it was very homey-like. And that's one of the things. Prostitutes in the 1880s didn't have the social stigma that you might think. If you look at the 1880 census, there are many people who listed their occupation as prostitute. They weren't trying to hide it. Everybody knew what was going on. Now, by the 1870s, there was a group of middle-class, respectable women who were putting a lot of pressure on the prostitutes. And this was the focus of that.
Yeah, here we are. This is Prostitution Central.
Is this Microsoft?
Yeah. So this was the
Microsoft is right where Emma
This was the
Merlotin
cottage, That's pretty funny.
The problem with this neighborhood as a venue for prostitution is just a couple blocks down, you have some of the most prominent churches in town. And so people could see the prostitutes from when they come out of church. One of the first things they'd see was this prostitution district. So it put a lot of pressure on the people who lived here, and especially after the murders, they were forced out. And then after about 1888 or so, most of the prostitution in town was located in the North End. Before that, though, it wasn't. It wasn't confined at all.
So speaking of property, as far as the Merlotin case is concerned, there is an interesting wrinkle, right? That when she died, she had a lot of assets, right? That her brother came from France to claim.
Yes.
In the following year, is that right?
I think it is the following year that he came, and then there's a case that lasted for a couple of years that finally ruled that he was her only living relative. It's interesting because it brings a character into the plot who obviously is important. His name was Gustave Tingray. He was also from France. He was a jeweler, and he was the co-owner of the property that Emma Merlotin owned. He had his jewelry shop on the property. It was down on First Avenue. Or no, on Front Street.
On Front Street.
And after Emma Merlotin died, he had to pay off the mortgage, so he put a lot of pressure on the court to process the probate, figure out who the heir was so he could sell that property and get his half. And eventually it went to Joseph Lacaze. But Tingray is an interesting character, and I wonder why his name is on her headstone, why he owned the property with her. He was obviously involved with her in some way, but we really don't know how.
Here we have maybe a couple of possible ways this could have gone, right?
Yeah, I think one possible solution to the murder lies in city politics at the time. After James Brown's murder in 1881, the Tenderloin suddenly was seen as a bad place, and the pressure that the respectable women in town were putting on that area really came to a head. Personal and political motivations were really mixed up at this time.
And then there's the issue of possibly robbery, but we already kind of mostly that would be tricky unless it was just they were interested in a particular wad of cash and not in anything else.
Yeah.
The other one might be...
Well, there is a rumor that one of her customers was a member of a prominent family who was crazy and who may have done it because of his insanity or because he was trying to cover up his involvement with prostitution. No idea who that would have been.
And of course, prominent family makes it awfully hard tracking things.
And if it was that would explain why it was never solved. Because the police only solved the murders that the city wanted them to solve, if they solved those.
And that's an important point, right? And a lot of times when we might think about these kinds of cases, we might think that, well, if they really, have all these people out there working hard, there must be something really impossible about this case, otherwise it'd be solved. But that's not necessarily always the case.
Sometimes it's pretty obvious who the killer was in a case like that.
Can't be touched.
And it's pretty obvious why it wasn't solved, too. It's 140 years ago that this happened. We might never know the real answer. But just looking at it for a few days has brought up so many questions that seem never to have been answered. I am sure that there's information out there that can still be gained on this case.
Yeah, and learned a lot, too, about sort of how different things were. Attitudes toward prostitution were different. Just the fact that what used to be a brothel is now Microsoft. All kinds of things change, right?